We are coming to you live tonight from a U.S. military base inside the international zone, a.k.a. the Green Zone, here in Baghdad. After nearly 7.5 years of war here, the United States combat mission in Iraq, for all intents and purposes, is over. There will be a handover at the end of the month, and about 2,500 more troops will leave here this month. But the last combat battalion of the last combat brigade is gone. If you were with us last night here on MSNBC, you saw those breathtaking images of the final U.S. combat brigade crossing the Iraqi border into Kuwait.
Is this the end of the war?
It's the end of Operation Iraqi Freedom. And it is the end of war as we have come to know it as American soldiers and as America. Our brigade is the last combat brigade in Iraq, and this is a symbolic image of the brigade combat team participation in Operation Iraqi Freedom in the end of 7 years of war.
That was U.S. Army Colonel John Norris, the commander of the 4th Stryker Brigade, the last combat brigade out. We arrived in Iraq this past weekend, and since we've been on the ground here, we have spent as much time as we can trying to understand the training and support mission that U.S. forces are now engaged in with Iraqi forces. The new mission is a training mission. It's not a combat mission, but Iraq is still a dangerous place for Americans serving here and, of course, for Iraqis. Just within the last 24 hours, a roadside bomb exploded in eastern Baghdad, injuring 2 people. 3 roadside bombs went off in the northern city of Mosul, injuring 4 Iraqi policemen. Another Iraqi policeman was gunned down in western Mosul. And armed gunmen in the city of Kirkuk attacked the headquarters of the Kurdish intelligence services. That's the situation. That's a 24-hour period, a typical 24-hour violent situation here that Iraqi forces have now inherited, along with the 50,000 U.S. troops who will stay to advise and assist them, even as tens of thousands of other Americans head home. Last night, NBC's chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel was embedded with members of the 4th Stryker Brigade, the 2nd Infantry Division, the last brigade out of here. 150 members of that same brigade who left earlier this month were welcomed back home today at a ceremony at Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington State. Members of the 4-2 Raiders arrived home from a 1-year deployment here, and in a sign of just how long this war has stretched on and that now better understood effects of this war on our returning soldiers, I want you to listen to the earnest plea that those troops heard today from their commanding officer before they were dismissed.
There is a grateful nation for all that you do. I would also ask to the soldiers over the next few days, weeks, and even months, that you look out for each other. The buddy plan is in effect. If it doesn't look right, it doesn't sound right, doesn't seem right, it's probably not right. So don't be afraid to talk it out with each other. Don't be afraid to bring something up to your chain of command if you think it needs it. Let's not lose anyone at this point.
Let's not lose anyone at this point. Today, the U.S. Army reported new suicide figures for troops. 27 U.S. troops are believed to have taken their own lives last month. That number was down from 32 the month before. It's still historically high. The newest combat troops home from Iraq are America's newest veterans, and they will remain combat veterans for the rest of their lives. And we as Americans have a responsibility to pay them back for their service as veterans for the rest of their lives as well. It's a responsibility that we talk about a lot. Politicians in particular like to talk about it a lot, but it is a responsibility that we've had a hard time fulfilling. Over a decade in which 2 of the longest wars in American history have been fought at the same time by a relatively small all-volunteer force. Joining us now is Iraq War veteran John Soltz. He's the co-founder and chairman of the group VoteVets.org. Mr. Soltz, thanks very much for joining us tonight. It's nice to see you.
Thank you, Rachel.
So today, John, we heard that returning commander in Washington State pleading with his returning soldiers to look out for each other now that they're back home from here. How alarming is this suicide problem among returning veterans? When civilians think about our responsibilities to veterans, how important is this as an issue?
It's a huge issue. In fact, what the commander was saying on the lead-in is basically what the chief of staff of the Army and the vice chief have been doing. I mean, we've had stand-downs both in the National Guard and the Reserve side and the active component side. At times, we've lost more troops to suicide when they return home than we've even lost in clips during combat. But the problem, it's much deeper than just taking someone for help. There's no blood diagnosis test for PTSD, for post-traumatic stress. So a lot of the times you've seen where soldiers have gone for diagnosis and they're being told, hey, you have an adjustment disorder or you have a pre-existing mental condition, and they're denied benefits. And that's where we have suicide and homelessness. So it's a lot more important than just diagnosis. It's getting them into the system and getting them help, getting them into the system so they get disability payments.
John, right now we're seeing in particular an increase in suicides among National Guardsmen, National Guardswomen, and reservists. Why is that? Do you have any insight into why the Guard and Reserve might be having a particular problem with this issue?
Absolutely. When Guard and Reservists go to Iraq, they go through what's called a mobilization center. A lot of them are from units all over the country. The war overextended us so much that you may have, 30% from a unit from Wisconsin, 30% from a unit from Minnesota, and 30% from a unit from Virginia, and you patch them together and you send them to war. And then when they come home, it's 12 months, they go back through a mobilization center like at Fort Dix, New Jersey, or Camp Shelby, Alabama, and they're there and they tell the shrink they're okay, and then they go home. And they don't really have to show up to a battle assembly for maybe 6 more months. When they go back home, a very small percentage of the population served in the war, and there's not that support structure. The ACT component brigade commander you saw in the lead-in, he's going to see his soldiers next week and the week after and the week after. So Guard and Reservists, they go home. There's a huge unemployment problem with Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. It's something like 22% nationally. So they kind of get lost in the system, so it's a much higher rate. They don't fall under TRICARE as soon as they come out of the system. They're relying on the VA system, and there's obviously a transfer problem there, so it's a huge issue in that community.
We have seen a big increase in funding for the Veterans Administration overall. We've seen this president talk quite a bit about the need to care for people coming home from battle, people coming home from these long and multiple combat tours. We've seen people talk about it, and we've seen the funding. But is it manifesting as better care? Is the Obama administration, is the Pentagon doing enough to get their hands on around this problem?
Well, the DOD from their side, the Department of Defense and the Pentagon, they basically had shutdowns. Every military unit is so aware of the suicide issue and identifying soldiers that may hurt themselves. And from that standpoint, yes, the commands, like you heard the colonel saying, are very interested in if there's a soldier problem and getting to that. But in regards to the getting people help, it's a much harder process. And frankly honest, a month ago, the President of the United States, President Obama, actually addressed this issue in a national radio address on a Sunday afternoon where he said, hey, we want to get more people into the PTSD program. We want to diagnose more people with post-traumatic stress. That's really the first major movement that we've seen on this issue since the beginning of the war. So I think that's obviously a great start from President Obama to address the situation.
John, one last question about the reason that I'm in Baghdad this week and the end of the combat mission here, the transition formally happening at the end of this month. Obviously, another 50,000 troops, up to 50,000 troops is going to be here for another 16 months. How important do you feel like this transition moment is in terms of the overall politics around the war and the overall American responsibility to appreciate and serve our veterans?
Well, yeah, first off, I appreciate the fact, Rachel, that you're there talking about these guys coming home. It was 7 years ago when I was in Baghdad, so I think that in itself is momentous. But I would flag for everyone there's a huge concern here that there's still a lot of troops left in combat. There still are combat troops in Iraq embedded with Iraqi units. 1 of every 3 U.S. troops dies by an improvised explosive device on the road. And the American public, if they're not still bracing for war, because this war is still continuing, then they're going to be surprised. In regards to the veterans coming home, only 0.5 of 1% is served. So it's a very small percentage you've ever served. So the most important veteran in the future of this war is actually going to be people that didn't fight. And we need everybody's help to make sure our veterans get what they need when they come home.
Iraq War veteran John Soltz, co-founder and chairman of the group VoteVets.org. And my friend, thanks a lot for your time tonight, John. It's really nice to see you.
Appreciate it.